everybody, and welcome to another episode of Zay Historicizes. I've never had thousands of people reaching out to me every single day telling me to hop in front of this camera and make another episode. So I want to thank you guys for all three of you that have been reaching out about that. I'm still trying to work on my consistency, and I do promise it is going to get much better. But I'm really excited for today's episode. It is sort of pride themed, and I do realize that we're basically at the end of July, but this is a topic that I've touched on briefly before, but I most definitely wanted to dive into, I guess in a lot more concerted and precise way. So today's episode is really going to be me historicizing drag in mainstream culture. So this is of course inspired by the fact that I do think that drag has taken a lot of flack recently, considering the social political leanings of things very recently in this country. But I think that we as a people tend to look at things in the context of now. Oftentimes whenever phenomena exist in our modern era, we oftentimes do look at it as being a creation of today. Drag being mainstream, of course, it's incredibly popular today. A lot of my friends have like drag watching parties. You know, you go out to the club, you see drag performers. And then of course we also live in the era of like RuPaul's Drag Race that has made many drag queens, you think of like Bob the Drag Queen in particular, these fairly household names. Drag is very mainstream now in a way that it arguably has never really been in American history. However, the whole purpose of this video is actually historicizing drag as a mainstream phenomena. And how I'm gonna do that is really just shed light on the way that drag proliferated in mainstream culture, mainly between the late 19th century into the mid 20th century. And the reason that I'm gonna look at that period is because a lot of that predates the modern queer and gay liberationist movements. So I've mentioned the book before, but I did have the chance to read Gay New York by George Chauncey. And in his book, what George Chauncey is really doing is showing how queerness and gay scenes in particular were incredibly popular and actually very known to people in major cities, specifically New York, before the queer liberation movement. So obviously you have Stonewall in 1969, and in 1970 you have the very first like official gay pride parade. That is June of 1970. It's the Christopher Street Day Liberation Parade. But what George Chauncey does in his book is really show how mainstream or how popular gay scenes and gay culture was in New York, dating all the way back to the progressive era and the Gilded Age. So what I'm going to be doing for this video is essentially looking back at that same era, but I am going to focus mainly on drag as, again, a mainstream phenomenon all the way back to the Gilded Age and progressive era, and the way in which many Americans, especially in major cities like New York and Chicago, for instance, were actually incredibly familiar with drag scenes, how drag was part of mainstream newspapers, how drag was part of mainstream magazines, how many people in these cities were very, very familiar with drag performers, up to and including, of course, the pansy craze in the 1930s, where drag even made its way all the way up to Hollywood. So again, the purpose of this video is really just historicizing drag as a mainstream phenomena. To kick things off, where really to start other than America's first official drag organization? The very first organization in the United States that actually hosted drag balls and pageants, and that is, of course, the Hamilton Lodge 710 in Harlem, New York. So the history of the Hamilton Lodge is a fairly interesting one. It does start from a black sailor in the 1840s by the name of Peter Ogden. I had researched Peter several years ago. Well, I had researched specifically the Hamilton Lodge because I was writing an article for LGBTQ Nation, but I wasn't able to find that much information on Peter Ogden, other than the fact that Peter Ogden was a black sailor, and he was part of a fairly well-to-do class of free black people in the 1840s and 1850s. Of course, you have to remember that this is also before emancipation, and he does live in New York, so he is most definitely pretty far removed from, let's say, chattel enslavement as it would have been, because considering this was still part of the antebellum era in the South. And what Peter Ogden is looking to do is establish a lodge. However, for obvious reasons, establishing a lodge as a black man in the United States in the 1840s is not a very easy thing to do. So he actually goes and seeks help overseas, specifically in the United Kingdom. So he essentially goes to Britain to seek help in establishing a lodge, and he is able to find support there. So he goes back to the United States, where he officially establishes Hamilton Lodge 710 of Odd Fellows. So this is a very sort of like interesting tangent that I want to take very quickly, because he names it the Hamilton Lodge of Odd Fellows, but in the 1840s and 50s, when you hear Odd Fellows, think of Odd Fellowship as like diversity. People of different races, people of different ethnicities, nationalities, who are all coming together to really help form this lodge, because that was part of it. Of course, this was in part collaboration. So Odd Fellows is really where they derive Odd Fellowship from there, this very diverse fellowship. From what I was able to see, I found an image of Peter Ogden, and is it just me, or does every man from like the mid-19th century, regardless of their race, kind of resemble Abraham Lincoln? Like, he looked like incredibly presidential to me. Like, just imagine him with a top hat. Anyway, back to the topic. Peter Ogden, from what I could see, he's not part of the community. Like, I couldn't get anything about him like being gay or queer or anything like that. And Peter Ogden does establish like several other lodges. A lot of the men who are part of Hamilton Lodge, a lot of those men do with Peter establish plenty of other lodges. It does seem very interesting to me, however, that this Odd Fellowship actually turns into America's first sort of like official like drag organization, because we do know that by the time you get into the late 1860s, the Hamilton Lodge ball is sort of underway. By the time you're getting into the 1860s, that is when the Hamilton Lodge does start throwing its first official balls, around 1868 or 1869. And my theory about that is because the Hamilton Lodge 710, specifically in Harlem, was about Odd Fellowship, I do think that in a lot of ways, Peter Ogden may have actually attracted queer or, more effeminate men to the lodge as part of that Odd Fellowship. And even up until the 1920s and 30s, they actually do refer to some of the Hamilton Lodge balls as Odd Fellows balls. So I do think that there is that connection there. So Peter Ogden himself wasn't necessarily queer or gay or anything like that, but I think because he was establishing and really pushing for Odd Fellowship, he may have attracted characters like that to the Hamilton Lodge ball. So again, he establishes that in the 1840s. By the late 1860s, you are beginning to see the Hamilton Lodge ball take shape in Hamilton Lodge 710. So that is some background there on the Hamilton Lodge, and at least definitely its beginnings in the mid-19th century under Peter Ogden, who was a black sailor and not, so yeah. So as I stated, the Hamilton Lodge balls are essentially underway by the time you get to the end of the 1860s. The earliest narratives we have on the Hamilton Lodge balls come out of black newspapers in New York, right in the 1880s and the 1890s. So just looking through a lot of black papers in New York that refer to the Hamilton Lodge specifically, you do start to see them actually discuss these receptions in the 1880s. I do have a theory about the Hamilton Lodge balls and receptions. And that theory is that at the time that they initially started, they actually resemble more, it seems to me they resemble more like costume contests, like masquerades. People are going there dressing up as these characters. But think of something kind of like Mardi Gras, which actually leads directly into what I'm going to be reading very soon. Before you get into this sort of like full-blown drag pageant and reception of the Hamilton Lodge, I do believe the beginnings of the Hamilton Lodge balls and receptions, however, were more so tied to like just general costume contests and masquerades and things like that. So the very first article, because I'm going to be reading a lot during this episode, but the very first nod to the Hamilton Lodge that I'm going to be reading is going to be from the New York Globe, and this is the New York Globe dated February 24th of 1883. So this is fairly long. I'm going to go ahead and get into it, but again, this is painting the Hamilton Lodge reception as it was had in February of 1883, according to the New York Globe. The night of Tuesday, February 20th, could not have been a pleasanter one for the masquerade reception of Hamilton Lodge, number 710. Had it been made to order. At an early hour, carriages began to arrive on Wendell Hall, West 44th Street, bearing within them masked visages that excited the admiration and wonderment of the onlookers at the door. There was a grand march of the lodge and invited guests at 11 o'clock, but the grand march proper, comprising the maskers and the whole company, did not take place until after 12 o'clock. The diversified characters of the mask, no two being alike, and the playful humor of those who were in costume was the occasion of very favorable commentary by the large mass of onlookers. The general verdict was that it was one of the best masked balls ever given in the city. If our readers will bear with us a moment, we will briefly run over a few of the characters that caught our repertorial eye. They were kings, queens, knights, policemen, peasant girls, tramp, very good, Vivandiers, the African queen, the Globe, a Spanish girl, a jockey, a Jew, excellent, monks, nuns, Italian organ grinder, and little girls, and a numerous throng too lengthy to go into detail about. When the procession took place just prior to supper, it brought to mind the recent Mardi Gras festival at New Orleans. The excellent taste displaying in the selection of costumes cannot be too highly commended, and it may confidently be said that the masquerade reception of Hamilton Lodge will be talked by the 600 or more present in years to come. So again, that is that's just a excerpt off of the New York Globe from February of 1883. This is the February 20th, 1883 masquerade ball for Hamilton Lodge. And again, he actually does mention, the writer here specifically mentions that it is reminiscent of Mardi Gras. So again, it's costumes, it's masqueraders, it's all those things. He's mentioning kings, queens, nuns. People are taking these ethnic personas like a Jew or Italian, all of those things. And again, this is New York in the 1880s. I talked about this in my Crisis of Masculinity video, which I'm going to allude to, but you do have a very quickly growing and a very diversified New York at that time. Of course, as it's always been and it is until today. So I'm gonna go ahead and read another article. This one is going to be from the New York Freeman in March of 1886. This is March 6th of 1886. So this is 3 years later. But I do want to go ahead and read this one because I think this is fairly significant as well. So this is titled Hamilton Lodge Reception. At an early hour, the masqueraders began to arrive in carriages that blocked the street for fully 1.5 hours. This lodge has given its 4th masquerade, and so far as success is concerned, it was the foregone conclusion known by the sale of tickets. This masquerade reception, though distasteful to many oddfellows and their friends, was conducted in a manner that reflects credit on the committee of arrangements. Receptions given by the oddfellows of this city for the last 30 years have been of the very highest type. The innovation of masqueraders has caused a change in public sentiment to the high standing of the order, and while no just reason or law is established save that of protest against masquerades, Hamilton Lodge no doubt will give one every year. Our people have not on the general principle been educated to this kind of demonstration, and many condemn its class. If we are to judge Hamilton Lodge's masquerade with the masquerades given by other institutions, it is a very credible affair, as and very deficient to decent subjection. The costumes this year eclipsed any previous effort in many white receptions of similar kind of this season. The costumes were of the widest variety. Professor Green, in the gaudy dress of the Turk, said he was making a tour through Africa, but was surprised to find such a mixed company of natives. No doubt this masquerade is the event of the season. So again, that is actually the New York Freeman 3 years after the first one I read. This is March of 1886. And one thing that's very interesting is that he actually specifically mentions here that this specific masquerade has been condemned by people who are part of some of the other lodges in Harlem at the time, masquerades of this class. I do think that Hamilton Lodge is very clearly kind of evolving, but it seems that by 1886, there may be a bit of a drag element to it. He mentions Professor Green in a gaudy dress of the Turk, and I'm not trying to like take it very literally, but it does seem the Hamilton Lodge is gaining that reputation for part of that queerness, that flamboyance, that extravagance maybe that people might not associate with many men in that era, and a lot of the men who are attending these masquerade balls are dressing up in that way. So there is that controversy to the Hamilton Lodge that you're most definitely seeing here that maybe had not been part of the lodge 20 years earlier when they started hosting some of these receptions. It does seem to me that by the time you get into the later part of the 19th century, the Hamilton Lodge is at least being associated increasingly with drag performers and drag performances and cross-dressing and things like that. And it most definitely has that association when you get into the 1900s, but it does seem to be these are the beginnings of those steps, at least from what I was looking into in my research. In the 1890s in New York, something is happening. I mentioned earlier my Crisis of Masculinity video because I think these subjects are kind of tied, but in my Crisis of Masculinity video, I mentioned that essentially by the time you get into the very tail end of the Gilded Age and you're coming to the Progressive Era, there is this crisis of masculinity that is occurring where a lot of men feel as if they're being emasculated by their societies. In that video, I mentioned the closing of the frontier, the Great Frontier. I mentioned the sort of the dissipation of the separate spheres mantra, first wave feminism, but I also do mention the growing visibility of the fairy in that era. And in the Gilded Age or Progressive Era, the fairy really just refers to a very feminine man, a man who may talk in a more high-pitched voice, a man who may have a bit of sachet to his step, the limp wrist, all of the things that we may associate with like gay people today. That is the idea of the fairy in the Gilded Age. And in 1892, mainstream New York papers do begin to print for purposes of vice, essentially, where they're saying this is what's wrong with our city. They're starting to focus on fairies and fairy resorts and Boweries in that era. One of the most notorious would have been Paris's Hall. And George Chauncey does mention Paris's Hall in gay New York. That was just very, very known in the city as far back as the 1890s to be where a lot of fairies would conglomerate. So this next quick tidbit I'm going to be reading is actually from an article that appeared on the Evening World, and this was on June 9th of 1894, and it is titled "Foul Dive on the Bowery." And this is one of those articles where you're seeing mainstream New York papers essentially being like, this is what's going on in our city and this is really degenerate. And they do focus again on that growing visibility of the fairy. So I'm going to be reading like just a tidbit from this article here, but it's titled "The Character of the Frequenters." But again, this article is saying foul dive on the Bowery. Columbus Hall is a resort for disreputable people of both sexes. The excise law violated. So again, it's not a positive article anyway, but I'm going to be reading the section titled "Character of the Frequenters." Most of the male frequenters of the place have effeminate voices, paint their faces, black their eyebrows and lashes, and in loud clothes parade the streets during the earlier part of the evening, leering at every person from whom they get a casual glance in passing. By 10 o'clock, the place is usually pretty well filled, and the men and women sit about the tables and drink. That is when a sightseer comes in who is willing to buy for others besides his own party. The man at the piano, who seems to have an aversion to wearing a coat, bangs away at the instrument. At times, he is assisted by two men with violins. Every few minutes, one of the men ascends the stage and sings. The songs are not usually in themselves bad, but the gestures and general makeup of the vocalist are disgusting. The patrons of the place pay little or no attention to the song, but spend their time commenting on the singer's appearance and in telling stories or adding to the noise made by the piano by singing vulgar parodies of the song. So again, this is June 9th of 1894, where this is a mainstream New York paper, the Evening World, that is again shedding light on these fairy resorts, these Boweries, these places where the fairies are conglomerating. And they're shedding light slightly on like drag performances. So these are men who may dress like a woman. These are men who are doing their makeup. These are men who are acting very effeminately. And they're also coming on stage to sing to these songs while of course the participants are looking at what clothing they're wearing. But then at the same time, they're doing like these sort of like vulgar parodies of a lot of these songs. I kind of wonder what songs they would have been doing like in 1894. It's pretty interesting. But again, by 1894, you are once again seeing the growing popularity, or at least the growing mainstream awareness of the fairy in a lot of these places where the fairies go to conglomerate. There's women there. There are men who aren't even considered fairies there. These are just night spots, but the fairy becomes the focal point of a lot of these spaces. And New York in the 1890s, again, is where you have the rise of a lot of immigration coming from Eastern and Southern Europe in particular, and they're going to New York. And in a lot of ways, with these articles, in my mind, it almost kind of does this thing where they're shedding light on this phenomena, which they consider disgusting, but at the exact same time, with New York being such a rapidly growing city, it almost seems to be like the presence of the fairy does increase in so many ways, because a lot of men who may fit that category in other parts of the country or even internationally are making their way to New York, and they are finding community there. By the time you get into the early 1900s, what you're also on the heels of is the Great Migration that is going to take millions of Black Americans out of the Jim Crow South. And you have a lot of Black Americans who are settling specifically in places like Harlem, and a lot of Black fairies themselves are also going to be a big part of these scenes and these communities. So on one hand, they're most likely shedding light on these things as a way to, obviously get rid of them. This is not a positive article. And you do have anti-vice societies that are popping up in New York at the time, specifically to make sure that, the fairy is not going to become this sort of normalized thing in New York. But at the exact same time, with this growing awareness of these places, you most definitely have an increase in the people who are actually patronizing a lot of these establishments. So I do want to shed light here, because in the 1890s, you do have that growing visibility of the fairy. And I think in many ways that also alters the popularity of Hamilton Lodge, once from this sort of masquerade ball, but at the same time, you're now attracting all of these fairies, a lot of these sort of femme queens, essentially. So by the time you get into the early 1900s, the Hamilton Lodge is 100% this place of drag. The Hamilton Lodge receptions are drag pageants straight up. And that is a culture that is most definitely fostered by, one, again, this growing awareness, but 100% also the Harlem Renaissance. Another thing that really expands the popularity of the Hamilton Lodge is really just the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, of course, is what is a result of the Great Migration and the arrival of many Black Americans, specifically to Harlem. Now, the Hamilton Lodge was established in Harlem by a pretty well-to-do class of free Black people in the 1840s, but that class is only increasing and becoming more prominent by the time you get into the 1920s and 1930s. And people have to forget sometimes how queer the Harlem Renaissance was. I mean, this was the era where you have this is an era where you have Gladys Bentley dressed up as a man, openly flirting with women in the audience. This is the era where you have the Ubangi Club, which is essentially the gay club of Harlem, where Gladys is performing, flanked by a chorus full of literal drag queens. This is the era of Langston Hughes. There's just queerness is very, very much a focal point of the Harlem Renaissance. And in a lot of ways, I believe a lot of the Black men who are arriving, a lot of the queer Black men who are arriving in Harlem in that era are feeling they're for the very first time living in an era and a culture where they can fully and freely be and express themselves. And it doesn't surprise me at all that the Hamilton Lodge reception absolutely blows up. It goes through the roof in popularity in the 1920s and 30s. There are thousands of people coming from all over the country to participate in and watch the Hamilton Lodge Ball. This is a mixed reception. It's a Black organization, but a lot of people, white, Asian, Hispanic, people of all ethnicities and nationalities are coming to this specific ball so that they can go and participate in the drags that are happening there. So I'm going to go ahead and read just a couple of the articles that I pulled from this specific era. So this one I'm going to read is from the Afro-American from the week of April 13th of 1932. And this is titled Queer Sex Busy Planning Drag. So New York, the queer sex has deserted the wide open spaces to remain indoors, busily engaged in designing and making new gowns for the perverted social affairs they hold every year during the month of April. 300 of both races, regaled in the height of feminine fashion, strolled the length of the Renaissance ballroom last week, vying for cash prizes. Our members of the third sex were showing a keenness for blonde wigs. 2 more public drags are scheduled for the month of April. An Arabian Nights Ball will be held at the Savoy Ballroom next Saturday. The season will close the following weekend at the Rockland Palace. Babe Baker will officiate. So that is the Afro-American. That is the week of April 23rd of 1932. And the title specifically says, Queer Sex Busy Planning Drags. This is the Hamilton Lodge reception at Rockland Palace. By the time you're in the 1920s and 1930s, it is a drag ball. It's no longer just this masquerade ball that is reminiscent of Mardi Gras. It is a full-blown drag pageant. And in that era, you are 100% seeing people refer to the Hamilton Lodge as it's a place where people go to do drags. This next one that I'm going to read is from the New York Age, March 6th of 1926. It's saying, Hamilton Lodge Ball, an unusual spectacle. 58th masquerade furnishes occasions for dressing of men as women. The masculine women and feminine men, how are you going to tell the roosters from the hens? This little ditty might very well have been sang at the 56th Masquerade and Civic Ball of Hamilton Lodge, which was held last night at the Renaissance Casino Friday night, February 26. It seems that many men of the class generally known as fairies and many bohemians from the Greenwich Village section took the occasion to mask as women for this affair. They appeared to make up at least 50% of the 1,500 people who packed the casino, and in their gorgeous evening gowns, wigs, and powdered faces were hard to distinguish from many of the women. All the prizes awarded for the most artistic masquerades seem to have gone to them. Although Hamilton Lodge is a colored organization, there were many white people present, and they danced with and among the colored people. Many people who attend dances generally declare that the Masquerade and Civic Ball was the most unusual spectacle they had ever witnessed. They do go ahead to actually list the prize winners as well. So this is something that you do see constantly with a lot of the Hamilton Lodge receptions in the 1920s and 30s. It is very mainstream. They are full-blown listing the names of the winners, but they're also posting their images as well. In this one image, you do see, it says, two of the many costume contestants at the Hamilton Lodge Masquerade Ball last Friday night at the Rockland Palace are shown above. Jean Lamar at right was winner of first prize. The other cutie is none other than Peaches Lorraine, who, although quite well known about town, was only a runner-up this year. So again, this is the part where, I mean, it's very, very clearly about drag by the time you get to the 1920s and the 1930s. And it is incredibly mainstream. These are mainstream papers that are full-blown posting images. They're posting the names of these winners. They even posted where some of them live. And it's not like they're posting it to expose these people. It's not this very disgusting approach that they have to it. They're just saying that this is the annual Hamilton Lodge drag pageant. These are the drag queens that are involved, and these are the drag queens that are known around town. These are their images. These are the winners. This is what they won. And it's important to note also that police officers in this era are full-blown officiating the balls. Police officers are not going to these balls to disrupt them. They're not going there to put an end to them. They're going there to keep spectators at bay. They're going there to keep the peace. New York in the 1920s and 30s is, again, this sort of like, you know, it's this prohibition era, essentially, when you get into the 1930s. And in that era, you do see that police officers are not, they're not there as, you know, anti-peace. They're actually there to officiate these balls. And that is one of the most interesting things about the Hamilton Lodge in that era. The era of the 1930s, the era where drag is really as mainstream as it ever was before you get into the modern era, really feeds into helping the Hamilton Lodge Ball become this center, this spectacle of mainstream drag life and culture in that era, in the 1930s. So definitely wanted to give a nod and a shout out to some of those newspaper articles, because they most definitely show the changings of the balls from this masquerade ball to this full-blown drag pageant by the time you get into the Harlem Renaissance. While the Hamilton Lodge reception is really getting started and going off in popularity around the time you get into the 1880s, there is another very interesting man, a very interesting character who is becoming the focal point of drag in his community. And that is actually America's very first self-official drag queen, and that is, of course, William Dorsey Swann. So William Dorsey Swann is another very interesting character, because William Dorsey Swann actually happens to be the exact same era as the Hamilton Lodge Ball. So I am going back to the 1880s for this specific case, because right around the time where, of course, I was reading a lot of those early Hamilton Lodge receptions in the 1880s, right around that time in DC, William Dorsey Swann is getting very notorious for William Dorsey Swann is becoming pretty notorious for throwing drag parties in DC. At this point, it's just something that he constantly does. And the only reason we really know that Dorsey Swann existed is because so many DC papers were constantly running his stories and just constantly running into his antics, as far as like constantly throwing these drag parties and drag raids. So the very first one that I'm going to read, this is from the Evening Star DC, dated January 15th of 1887, and it is titled "Police Raid on a Dance House." So last night at about 10 o'clock, several detectives with a squad of officers from the 2nd Precinct paid a visit to the house of Pierce Lafayette, a colored messenger in the Princeton office, and raided a drag given by a party of whites and blacks. The house is a 2-story frame and is elegantly furnished. Professor Gardner sat at the piano while those who gave the drag danced with the invited guests. 2 of the male dancers were naked. When the officers entered the house, the inmates made a rush for the outside and a number of them escaped. The officers arrested several of them, however, and this morning in the police court, Edward Williams, Benjamin Swan, Daniel Swan, William Johnson, Charles Myers, and Dorsey Swann were arraigned on a charge of being suspicious persons. 5 of them, who gave feminine names at the station house, were attired in silks and satins of bright colors. The court required them to each give bond in default of 90 days. So again, that is from January of 1887, and it is worth noting that Dorsey Swann was from a fairly big family, and 2 of his brothers, who actually are named here, Benjamin Swan and Daniel Swan, were also involved in the drags as well. I believe it was actually Benjamin Swan who would like make the clothes, like the gowns and the outfits and things like that. So that is like one of the, probably the very first instance we hear of William Dorsey Swann actually being arrested. So I'm going to go ahead and read the next one. And this one is specific. This one is from April 13th of 1888. It is from the Washington Critic, because this is actually from William Dorsey Swann's 30th birthday party, because William Dorsey Swann was like in Aries, just like me. So this is titled "A Drag Party Raided." And again, this is April 13th of 1888. So this morning, John Smith, Jacob Byard, William Dorsey, who by the way was the Queen, Charles Myers, Jacob Lewis, John Lewis, Samuel Jackson, James Waters, Laura Howard, James Taylor, Benjamin Moore, and Lewis Jackson, so lots of famous people there apparently, were charged in the police court with being suspicious characters. Last night, attired in handsome silks and satins, each in complete feminine costume, they indulged in a drag in a quiet-looking house on the south side of F Street, near 12th. The party was raided by Lieutenant Amiss and the officers of the First Precinct. Nearly all of the girls succeeded in procuring bail, ex-commissioner of pension Dudley becoming bond for William Dorsey, who is in his employ. So again, another really hilarious article of William Dorsey Swann's plans being foiled and his drag being raided. So again, that is from 1888. That is actually supposed to be like, that was supposed to be his 30th birthday party celebration. My very first Unhinged newspaper stories, if you guys remember, I read an article of some drag queens being arrested in DC, and that was from 1885, which is actually several years before William Dorsey Swann starts appearing in the narrative. However, it does show that in DC, there does seem to be a pretty healthy drag scene that is there, as far as definitely in terms of like black queens, specifically like black drag queens. William Dorsey Swann was not one of the men who were arrested in that 1885 incident. So it does seem that even before Swan, or likely he was still part of that group, you do have the people in DC are pretty well aware of the happenings with some of the drag queens in the area. William Dorsey Swann is eventually arrested permanently, like finally in 1895, I believe, and he does spend a couple years in prison. He even asked for like a presidential pardon, which is really hilarious. But he doesn't remain in prison for too long. He is eventually released, and he passes away in 1925, actually right around the time that the Hamilton Lodge is peaking in popularity. I did, however, just want to give that shout out to William Dorsey Swann in particular, because he is such a pinnacle character in drag history, and a lot of people don't really know about him. I wrote an article for him in Pride Source, because he was born enslaved in Maryland, like one of 13 children, I believe. But he does have a very interesting story, and he most definitely is one of those queens that played a big part in establishing a community in DC in the literal 1880s and became notoriously known for essentially having his parties raided and then going right back up to start up again because he like literally just felt like it. I think it's very interesting though, because Dorsey Swann again is just he's such a pinnacle figure in drag history that a lot of people don't know about. but he is in many ways the first official like queen of drag, and he is very ironically happening right at the exact same time at the as the Hamilton Lodge Ball. So definitely wanted to shed light on Dorsey Swann and his contributions to the story. In George Chauncey's Gay New York, he actually coined the term the pansy craze. So the pansy craze is something that happens right around when you have like prohibition, and it peaks in the 1930s. So earlier when I mentioned how the Hamilton Lodge peaked in popularity in the 1920s and especially the 1930s, you have to understand that in the context of the pansy craze. So the fairy, the pansy, the lily, all of that really just refers to the very feminine, flamboyant man during that era. Of course, by the 1930s, you're out of the Gilded Age, you're kind of out of the progressive era, but of course, the pansy becomes a sort of like the term for characters like this, and specifically drag performers. And the pansy craze, which really peaks in the early to mid 1930s in the United States, is really that era where drag is as mainstream as it has ever been and will be for like almost the next century. People seem to forget that in the 1930s, you have drag performers who are going around the country as far out as places like Oklahoma and Texas to much success. You have performers like Jean Mallon, you have Ray Bourbon, you have Bruz Fletcher, all of these who are very, very famous and very prominent drag performers, and they are mainstream, as people like Jean Mallon is actually literally appearing in like Hollywood movies. In Hollywood in the 1930s, this is still sort of like pre-Hays Code, which is what I'm going to get into. This is like pre-Hays Code. So you do have a lot of, there are men who are very boldly in like, I mean, they're very, very pinnacle to a lot of these movies. With these very big studios, and they're very clearly queer. These are their characters in cartoons that are even fairly queer. And effeminate. So that is really what is happening in the 1930s, and why the pansy craze is referred to as what it is. It is as mainstream as drag ever gets, and it makes sense that on the backs of the pansy craze, you have the Hamilton Lodge become the center for drag around the country, and the Hamilton Lodge becomes almost this very celebrated mainstream event where again they can post winners' pictures and they can post winners' names without fear of these winners like being attacked. It's not about condemning them. They're essentially getting like a nice shout out, like their own 15 minutes of fame. And it's amazing to put it into that context of just how mainstream drag was in the 1930s. And again, that is on the heels of prohibition. This is just an era where everything goes. It's like the Bonnie and Clyde era, like the peak of like, you know, these like very notorious gangsters that we all know about. That's really what's happening in the 1930s. It's like a no holds barred free for all. But that does change by the time you get into the mid 1930s. And the reason it does is because of Hays Code specification. So one, the Hays Code is something that Hollywood begins to subscribe by, and it does until you get into the late 1960s. Around 1968 is when Hollywood no longer adopts the Hays Code. But the Hays Code does so much to completely rid any character that is deemed undesirable out of mainstream culture. So a lot of these characters that could have been celebrated and been a very big part of movies several years earlier, it's like a no-no. It even does a lot of, you know, specifically with like interracial unions, like there's just so much that the Hays Code does. And with that, you also have the rise of these anti-vice societies. So I mentioned anti-vice societies in the Gilded Age and the Progressive era, but the anti-vice societies really, really do spring up like nobody's business by the time you get into the late 1930s. And those anti-vice societies work to make sure that none of these things are happening anymore. The Hamilton Lodge has its very final reception in the 1930s, I believe 1935 or 1936. And after that, it's no longer accepted anymore. I mean, the New York government is actively looking to make sure that the Hamilton Lodge Ball is not a thing anymore. And to really put into perspective like how mainstream the Hamilton Lodge was, in April 5th of 1933, the New York Amsterdam News actually ran a review and photo for Surprises of 1933, and it featured a bunch of Harlem male doctors and dentists in drag. And there's a screenshot that I'm going to post here, but also read the caption here. It says, "Oh, you must come over here," this charming quintet of ladies seem to be saying. "No, it is not not the Hamilton Lodge Ball. It is only, and it goes ahead to list the names of the doctors and dentists who are appearing in drag. And the reference to the Hamilton Lodge Ball, which this article does reference, it's something that would have been immediately recognizable in 1933 to the readers of the New York Amsterdam News. So again, here you have the image of these men in drag, and the New York Amsterdam News is saying like, no, this is not the Hamilton Lodge Ball, this is something different. Again, putting into perspective how really mainstream the Hamilton Lodge Ball would have been, of course, by the 1930s. But again, things change by the time you get into the late 1930s. Those anti-vice societies are full-blown making sure that they can be rid of what you would call kind of like the sex perverts, introverts, those would have been names. And of course the fairy, names that would have followed queer people in that era. I also do want to note here that by the time you get into the early 1940s, the United States is full-blown going to be participating in World War II. And this is a pattern that you constantly see in American history, where the rise of war becomes this rallying cry for men to display abject masculinity. So any man who is just slightly effeminate or incredibly effeminate, really, like a lot of the participants of the Hamilton Lodge Ball would have been, that's not something that we can have. We need the most masculine men possible, of course, to go ahead and fight in this war. In college, I read a book titled like The Straight State by Margot Canaday, which is one of the most interesting reads I've ever had in my life. And she does talk about how the military, even in this era, is starting to hone in on the characteristics of the fairy or the feminine man, and starting to completely exclude those people and kind of like define them as being like mentally ill, so they can't even participate in the war as well. So that is the culture that the United States is swinging into when you get into the late 1930s and the early 1940s. So as mainstream and as popular as drag is in the 1930s, that almost completely changes. 10 years later, things are incredibly different. And as you come into this post-World War II era of conformity and this era of, you know, the white picket fence and the wife and the 2.5 children, you have all the soldiers coming back to start families as you get into the baby boom. Things are very different. In my research, it seems, however, that a lot of people don't seem to pick up on the fact that even when you get into the 1950s, drag is actually still fairly mainstream. There's this incorrect assumption that a lot of people and even historians have, is that drag sort of kind of went underground after the 1930s and doesn't really emerge again until you get into like the 1980s and 90s, specifically with characters like RuPaul or Divine, but that isn't the case at all, as I see in my research. And I will say my research is very heavy specifically into Black media, newspapers and magazines, because it does seem that in a lot of ways there was a lot less stigma towards those characters in Black media. So even though that does happen and the Hays Code of course occurs and drag is no longer as mainstream as it was in the 1930s, there are still a lot of instances I could cover in my research of drag being once again a pretty mainstream phenomenon in the 1940s and 1950s. So let's go ahead and get into that. Isn't it funny that as one thing goes, another thing arises? What is happening in the 1930s? All right, that's the Hamilton Lodge Ball is kind of, it's on its last legs. But in Chicago, so not New York, in Chicago, there's a man by the name of Alfred Finney, who is a street hustler in Chicago, who is starting to begin his own collection and community of drag queens on Chicago's South Side, Bronzeville. So Chicago is very similar to New York. Those are two cities that are incredibly impacted by the Great Migration. You have thousands of Black Americans who settle in New York, but you have many who are also settling in Chicago. In Chicago in that time, you have the Bronzeville. So Chicago's Bronzeville, or the Black Belt of Chicago, that is the South Side of Chicago, where a lot of Black Americans were settling. I always say, like, when it comes to certain decades in the 1900s, this is what I'd do. If I could go back to the 1920s or 30s for a week, I would do Harlem. If I went to the 1940s for a week, I would actually take Bronzeville, Chicago, the south side of Chicago over New York. Those are some of my all-time favorite photos. Like the obsession that I have with Chicago south side in the 1940s and 50s is like really, really crazy. But I just love what was going on there at the time. And Alfred Finney, being this hustler who is obviously trying to make a buck and finds a way to start this community of drag queens in Chicago south side, is incredibly fascinating. So it seems like the drag center as far as mainstream culture, at least with black media, moves from New York and goes to Chicago. And these become the Finney's balls, which at first appear to be like Halloween themed. A lot of people are coming up dressed up. However, I will say that the Finney's balls are off the bat about drag queens. He is taking all of these Bronzeville queens, the drag queens, and they are going there to wear their gowns and compete in drag balls and pageants. And again, these become pretty freaking mainstream, which is incredibly interesting to me. In 1951, Ebony magazine runs an advertisement for what is going to be going on for the drag ball amongst these drag queens in Chicago. Ebony magazine is also alluding in the early 1950s to all of the drag queens, the characters there, the drag Josephine Baker, the drag Billie Holiday, the drag Lena Horne. I was actually looking at some of the participants, and there is this really, really funny one that I see of Miss Lena Horne. And Jet magazine, which is part of the Johnson publications, I covered that when I did my story on Ebony last time. And Jet magazine, which is one of, easily outside of Ebony, the most popular black magazine in the country, is full-blown covering these drag pageants. They are covering the Finney's balls, the thousands of people who are coming to the Finney's balls. There are so many wonderful images of the drag queens who are participating in the Finney's balls. And again, this is a mainstream black paper in the 1950s. They're posting their names, they're posting these characters, much like you would have had with the Hamilton Lodge 20, 30 years earlier. And I definitely want to shed light on that. One thing that you also do see most definitely happening in this era is also the beginning of like a lot of drag personas. So in the 1920s and 30s, during the era of the Hamilton Lodge, I believe the most recreated persona was typically Mae West, who to me, Mae West is like the most before her time woman. Like I'm kind of just obsessed with Mae West and her one-liners, and I 100% understand why she was such a huge drag icon. But Ebony, of course, alluding to like drag Billie Holiday, drag Lena Horne, drag Josephine Baker. You can also see that a lot of drag queens in this era are full-blown taking on the personas of famous superstar women, as we would see occur later on, of course, with women like Diana Ross, Barbra Streisand, Cher, all the way to women like Lady Gaga and Beyonce, Ariana Grande today. So you most definitely see that connection as well. In California, you have Club Alabama, which is a black club, that's a black organization, and you do have drag pageants that are occurring in Club Alabama. And again, their pictures are being taken. You can see the winners' smiles. I mean, these are just really, really wonderful images. So again, you do have black media that is reporting on these drag queens. Part of me does have this theory that because the Hays Code also negatively impacted the visibility of black Americans in movies, it does seem to me that a lot of like black media, it was like already kind of like F the Hays Code anyway. So whereas mainstream media may not full-blown embrace a lot of what's going on, even though they're most definitely obviously like white drag scenes that would have been occurring at the time, black media does seem to spotlight these things without the stigmas that mainstream media would have tied to it. So much like with the Hamilton Lodge, where you have this black organization where a lot of white queens and other, people, drag queens of different races and ethnicities are coming, you have the exact same thing with the Finney's balls. When you look at images of the Finney's balls participants, you have a lot of white participants there. So it is a black organization that is essentially opening up space for queens of all different colors and backgrounds to come and, really have the space to feel comfortable and really feel well with themselves. So that is one thing that you are seeing with the Finney's balls in the 1950s. So again, the idea that drag just sort of like died and would not come back up again until you get into the 80s and 90s or like this post-Reagan era is absolutely not true. Even in the 1950s, even at the height of conformity, even at the height of the white picket fence and every other thing people love about dry America in that era, drag is pretty freaking mainstream. These are drag queens that are being posted on a very major black mainstream paper in the 1950s. So that is something that we most definitely cannot ignore. My all-time favorite photographer, who I've mentioned on here before, Charles Teeney Harris. Charles Teeney Harris, who again, he was a black man in Pittsburgh, and he took a lot of my favorite images of black Pittsburgh. He also does actually have wonderful images of the Pittsburgh drag scene. One of my favorite images is this image of these 4 black drag queens at the Granville Hotel in 1955. I've posted that on Reddit before. But again, you can see that these drag scenes exist, and they are fairly mainstream in these, certainly like these black spaces and black communities. So even again, in the 1950s, drag is still a fairly mainstream phenomenon. Is it as mainstream as it was in the 1930s? Not even close, but it is still mainstream enough to make the pages of very, very public mainstream papers. So that definitely is something that I wanted to at least spotlight for this video. By the time you get into the late 1950s, things are starting to change again. And really by the time you get into the 60s, what I mean, things are starting to change again. Of course, baby boomers are coming of age. And in the 1960s, it's really just, of course, the era where everything sort of comes to die. It's that time where the social political climate of the United States is changing so rapidly. And it does sort of open this bridge there where drag can once again sort of come into the mainstream consciousness of people. One of my favorite documentaries is called Queens at Heart. It's from 1967, and I'm going to show a bit of this montage here. And it does show a drag pageant in New York in 1967. So once again, in New York, drag kind of like is that center there. And drag does become this thing that is becoming a little more mainstream. In 1968, you have the release of The Queen, which is a full-blown drag documentary. And The Queen is actually following contestants of a drag pageant in 1967. So it comes out in 1968, but it was filmed in 1967. And The Queen is very, very interesting for several reasons. One, it was released in 1968 and it was filmed in 67. So it's pre-Stonewall. But at the exact same time, The Queen, it was actually pretty controversial when it came out. So I'm not gonna get into it too much for this video, but there was a lot of, and still is today, femphobia in the queer community. So the Mattachine Society, who are America's first sort of like gay liberation organization, who were founded in 1950, they have their paper, who is the, I'm trying to remember if it's like the Advocate. I'm gonna go ahead and I'll post it here, but the Mattachine Society do actually like deride the film. They do not like The Queen at all because they do not like the idea of drag queens representing queer people. So I will say that even in queer spaces, as mainstream as drag got, there was always that idea of drag queens as not being the best representatives because of course they're too feminine, they're too fairy, they're dressing up as women. The idea of being a sex pervert, a lot of that is associated with drag queens. However, what also makes the Queen documentary very fascinating is of course the character of Crystal LaBeija. That Crystal LaBeija is the founder of like house culture in underground New York. So Crystal LaBeija has already doing these pageants and she's been doing them for quite some time, and she's a very renowned drag queen in New York. However, there is that rant that she goes on backstage when she literally like walks off stage when they start announcing that they, you know, obviously Harlow wins the pageant. And what Crystal does know there is that these pageants are always unfair because black queens really rarely ever win anything, which is very ironic because even with the Hamilton Lodge Ball, even though it had been going on for so many years and it was a black organization, Jean Lamar was the very first black drag queen to actually win the Hamilton Lodge pageant in 1933, I believe. So it's like this thing that had been going on for a very long time. And like I stated, a lot of these organizations, a lot of the really big drag organizations were Black. These were things that were founded oftentimes by Black queens or Black people. And even in those, there was that marginalization of a lot of Black drag queens, not specifically winning pageants. So Crystal goes on her rant. She kind of goes in, she eats, and then she does establish house culture. And that house culture, that house ballroom culture is what we see with, let's say, Paris is Burning, which was filmed in the 1980s. It came out in 1991. And that does spotlight specifically this sort of like underground subculture of Black and, like Hispanic, Latino drag queens in New York in that era mainly. But you do see that even in the 1970s and 1980s, it is still fairly underground. Not that there aren't prominent, drag queens in the 1980s who do have like some mainstream success. I mean, Divine in particular, who is a huge subject of John Waters' films. Divine becomes this pretty mainstream drag queen who is, of course, in movies and things like that. But again, not quite like the 1930s. Ironic, however, that Paris is Burning comes out in 1991. And then in 1993, what happens? That is Supermodel of the World, New York. Supermodel of the World, RuPaul, takes storm. And RuPaul becomes, in many ways, really the first mainstream drag superstar that really takes it to everybody's televisions. And then, of course, years later, you have the RuPaul's Drag Race. So that's kind of like where we get to where we are today. Of course, I'm not focusing on that era. I was mainly focusing on, the Gilded Age and the Progressive era and into the mid-19th century, the mid-1900s, the mid-20th century. But again, that really... it really does show you that when you look at American history, when you go back, you are seeing that there are many instances where drag is actually really mainstream. Earlier I mentioned that we do have this propensity or this tendency for us to assume that what's going on now is because of us. It's our generation, and we're the first ones to really do it. And I think that sometimes even drag queens fall into this pattern where you're saying, oh, well, this is new, this is something that people hadn't really seen before, but that's not really the case. Drag has been mainstream many times in American history, and really taking a lot of these narratives, piecing and looking through these magazines and seeing these articles, you are seeing that there are many instances in American history where drag queens were full-blown mainstream. I don't know why I have this tendency to stop saying something and then I just smile, I don't know why I do that. But anyway, thank you guys so much for sitting through and watching another episode of Zay Historicizes. I'm not filming this on a Sunday night. I'm filming this on a Monday night, so I can't be sad for the week because it's already started. Hopefully I do get this edited and posted really quickly. But thanks as always for the support. Again, working on my consistency there. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week or weekend or whenever you'll be watching this. Thank you.